right now, intrigue and spies and espionage and explosions, a tale of North American German invasion. We have Don Kane here in our studio to talk about it. Hi, Don.
Hi, how are you? I appreciate the time on the air here.
I'm glad to have you in the studio. Halifax wrecked, and you're talking about the Halifax explosion. I want to get into the book and what it is that the story is that you're trying to tell, but a little bit about yourself. What's your background?
Well, Kane family came here in the 1860s, and my father or great-great-grandfather was in the military, had an option to either to stay here or go down to Bermuda and take land down there, so I was kind of still a little jealous that he could do that as opposed to stay here. But we ended up staying in the Halifax area. My great-great-grandfather was in charge of the production of the city streets for the city department.
Okay.
Then went into, my father was the Imperial Tobacco rep for the Atlantic Canada, and then I've been in Halifax most of my life, but in and out of Montreal, Toronto, Ottawa, Vancouver, doing cultural contracts. And,
okay. Do you have a background in the military in any way?
No,
Yourself?
I don't have any military background at all.
Espionage and spies? You got a background in that?
I'd like to sneak myself in there, but no, I'm just a researcher.
This book is entitled Spies, Espionage, and Explosions, and you tell a tale. You spin a story of connections of the World War I German invasion of North America. Where did you find your research? Where did you find this information from?
Well, basically what it was is, I'll give you an elevator ride here.
Please.
When I was a kid, I was caddying for my father out at Ashburn Golf Course, and I turned to him. He's with 4 people, and I sat there and said, "What'd you do in the war, Dad?" And he, what father's going to tell you what they did in the war, but he turned to me and he said, "I was in the Secret Service, and the Halifax explosion wasn't an accident."
What?
Then he went back to his, that's what I said. Then he went back to his golf game. Later on in life, I was working out of the National Museums of Canada, working with Trudeau out of his office on one of his pet projects, the National Museums of Canada, which is a train that went across the country. And I was responsible for the research of the objects that were actually real objects that were going into the train. The train was going into small communities, taking museums into small communities. So to keep my sanity, I was researching old pictures of Halifax and the Halifax explosion. And in that, all of a sudden, articles started turning up about the Halifax explosion, and I realized, God, maybe there's some truth to my story when my father was telling me as a kid. And then there was also pieces of paper I was picking up where my family was coming up in this research, and my great-grandfather was in the headquarters, Military District 6, which is up in the Citadel during the Halifax explosion. So since then, I spent the last 40 years of my life climbing in and out of archives up in Ottawa, and I've been down into Boston, into Washington. I've been in German archives, British archives, and Irish archives. And gathering all this information, I finally got to the point when I retired from my IT company I was running out of Purdy's Wharf. I decided, well, I might as well write my book now. Mm-hmm. And then when I started writing the book, I realized that all the files that I had gathered, I thought I was writing a book about the Halifax explosion because that's where my dreams and things were going. But when I started looking at the files, I realized that the same group of people, I was bringing files from various institutions back and forth, and they came across the same names turning up in 5 or 6 different situations. So the book expanded from the Halifax explosion into 5 real incidences where the same people who caused the Halifax explosion were involved with 4 other things. 1915, they blew up a Seattle boat off the shore of Seattle. Didn't cause as much explosion in Seattle because they were offshore. They were a munitions vessel that was supplying the Eastern Front in Russia. Then 1915, they were blowing up munition plants across Canada and the United States, and also bridges, same group. And then in 1916, the year before the Halifax explosion, Johansson, who was the guy that I believe caused the Halifax explosion, was tied in with the Black Tom explosion, which was a New Jersey wharf which held the munitions that were going over to the European site. And then again, we all grew up believing that the Canadian Parliament buildings was an accident, and it in turn was created by the same group. And the Prime Minister of the country at that time had one of his generals go out and actually track down who actually caused and what happened in the Parliament buildings. And he came back with this, 30, 40-page report tracking down who the guys were, where they came, how they came into the city, what munitions they had, where they got them from, how they got help, how they got out of the city. and there's a detailed report. And this is from a general giving it to the Prime Minister of Canada. And then after that, the Halifax explosion occurs with the same group of people. The book itself, I had trouble kind of writing it as a historical novel. I had to balance it between, is it a real history thing or a historical novel? And I've got no background in the history, I've never written history papers. I don't have any degrees. I don't have any written articles. So I decided to write it as a historical novel. But the novel itself is actually 50% actually archival files that if you actually go to the back of the book, all of the archival files that are listed there, so you as an individual reading the book can go into the archives and say, wow, this guy is got a little bit more in this book than just a fairy tale here.
Historical fiction. Don Kane, author, researcher, educator, and IT professional. And again, this it says the largest human-made explosion in history happened December 6, 1917. This book, following the scheming plans it's describing here on this handout of Germany's wartime leader, and you've uncovered, as you say, a suggestion that the Halifax explosion was not an accident. How so? What brings you to that conclusion?
Well, the Kaiser at the beginning of the war, actually before the war, realized that the war was going to be taking place and had his group of people research and develop how they could attack North America. So I've got all these files that are showing how the Germans, where they're going to attack in the Boston, New York, Washington area, and the Halifax area. And then he put spies into this area. And in the research, we've got the names and characters and how they're described and what they're doing in various areas. And you had the British ambassador, the ambassador for the British, he was actually following all these groups and actually sending notes up to the Prime Minister of the country about Parliament building is going to be blown up by the Germans and it's going to happen in the next little while. This ambassador was also spending half his time in Newfoundland because that's where most of the German activities where the subs were landing and getting the oil and supplies so that they could come through our coast. And they were actually during the First World War knocking out both Canadians and off Boston and New York. So it ties into the, this Johansen, who I believe caused the event. The Germans were actually giving enough information that they set up a wireless telegraph line right through from Boston all the way through Nova Scotia, and they were continually watching what was off the shores. In the last part of his life, 1922, he actually has a deathbed confessional where he's actually admitting to that he actually caused this event. And when you actually go down into the Black Tom explosion event down in New York, his name is actually attached to the vessel that was blown up there off the offshore, the supplies that were being sent over to World War I. So when you tie all these little knit things back and forth and you follow all the little clues, it leads you back into the Halifax explosion. And then at one point in the book, it actually explains how they moved through the harbor and actually caused the explosion. The Emo and the Mont Blanc was stuck at the beginning of the harbor. The wireless guys told them ahead of time that the Mont Blanc is not going to get through the gates, so they had to set up a whole system of changing the plans. The actual Halifax explosion was supposed to take place the day before, not the day that it actually closed or that it actually happened. And then when the nets were opened the next day, an American tramp steamer towing a couple barges moves in ahead of the Mont Blanc, blocks it, so it has to be forced over to the Dartmouth side. And then this scow actually crawls up the left-hand side of the harbor, and when the Emo's coming across from the Bedford Basin, it actually forces the Emo into the Dartmouth side so that the two vessels are actually bumping into each other. The Kaiser, way back when, you can imagine him looking at all these maps, and when he's looking at the Halifax Harbor map, he's sitting there saying, well, geez, this could be a really good place where they're going to supply log all the stuff and put them together and then ship them over to Europe. So all we have to do is blow up this little narrows. When you're looking at a map, it's pretty small. But, as Haligonians, we know it's a lot bigger than what it was. Mm-hmm. But he predicted where he wanted the boats to actually crash, and then hit shore. And the specific spot that he hit shore is about 3 to 5 minute walks where actually the munition plants where the British had their explosions there. So if we could have the explosion there and then get the munition plants to blow up, it would have flattened the whole city. The munitions plant were actually saved and they didn't blow up, or otherwise the whole city of Halifax would have been flattened. And then when you get right down to it, when you're talking about the Halifax explosion, there were 3 explosions during that time period. It was the Halifax explosion being the main one, but there was a second one, same thing, munitions boat moving into the Halifax harbor basically at the same point where the 2 boats crashed. And the only reason it didn't explode, because it was full of munitions, was because a group of dedicated Dartmouth citizens saw the fire on the boat. They crawled out into their boats and got onto the boat and actually stopped the fire. So that explosion was stopped. And then this is in the beginning of the trial, this actually happened. So this is in the January period. And then there's actually a third explosion, basically when the trial was just basically coming to an end. In the south end of the city, where they had an unloading of munitions, where the new train track rails had come into the south end of the city. So it wasn't just a Halifax explosion; there was actually 3 of them that actually were caused.
Don Kane, he is here with us. His book, if you're looking for Spies, Espionage and Explosions, A Tale of the North American German Invasion, it's published by Friesen Press. Last question. This is the first I've ever heard anyone spin this tale and bring forward this kind of information or evidence. Why do you think that no one else has talked about this till today, till your book?
Well, the reality is when you go into these archives, and you got to think as a Canadian, the number of people going to archives and want pieces of information. I go in there, I can only get about 12 pieces of information in the morning, 12 in the afternoon, and then I've been doing it for 40 years. So that to get the information I've gotten, you have to spend the 30 to 40 years. The other thing that's occurred during my lifetime was access to the internet. When the internet opened up and then started releasing stuff, you could get at international stuff a lot easier. And then also during that period, 2 other things occurred. The Pinkerton files. Pinkerton was actually bought by the Swedish company, and all the files were kept in the United States, but they didn't come until the last part of my research being released. And again, the Johansson name is brought into that thing as being one of the spies that they were watching. And then you also had the Kaiser's files, which were closed off and just came out for release within the last 3 to 5 years. So it is the allowance of time and the dedication of going in there and slowly grabbing piece by piece. And then as I started at the beginning of the interview, I thought I was doing a thing about the Halifax explosion. When I gathered all the pieces that I had gotten, I realized that there was one group that was involved with these 5 things, and they were running all over North America. So I guess it's just time and dedication that someone would have to spend to this project in the amount of time that I did.
Don, I want to thank you for coming in and sharing your story with us and A Tale of North American German Invasion. We've got your story to share with our listeners. If you'd like a copy of Don's book at 902-405-6000, give us a call now, and we'll give this out to caller number 10. Thank you for doing this, Don.
Well, let me end it by saying it's at Chapters, it's at Coles, and you can get it on the internet by going into the seinfo.site, which is SEE.info.ca. The C stands for Spies, Espionage, and Explosions. seinfo.ca.
Thank you very much, Don. We'll be right back after this.